And we're live on YouTube. Thanks everybody for showing up to another Open RFC deep dive. Um, Today we're going to be diving into the overrides RFC that Isaac's put together here. This is an expansion on a conversation we had about 2 weeks back about resolutions. And we formulated some ideas on this call about how we could imagine that API looking, that schema looking, and sort of what next steps we would take. So I've outlined in the agenda just some references to that conversation, that call, the notes we took there, as well as the RFC that Isaac's put together, who I'll let talk about that in a second. I just want to quickly note that these calls, of course, are all under the are orchestrated and operated under the code of conduct that we have listed in the and referenced in the npm RFCs repo. And so any conversation that we have here and also in those repos, we hope is constructive and everybody's thoughtful and mindful of each other. And in these calls, we just ask that people raise their hands as usual when they like to speak. And these calls, the intention here is to have a forum to interact with the community and hopefully move forward these conversations. And they've been fruitful so far. So we hope that we keep getting more folks come into them. Before we jump into the actual agenda, I'd love to know if there's any announcements from folks, any goings on that we should be aware of. If not, we'll just get into it. I see Jordan just jumped on as well. Again, if you want to add yourself or follow along in the HackMD document, I've pasted it there in chat, and also put it into the issue itself after the call. So the topic today, again, is resolutions/overrides. Isaac, I know you've put together the RFC and there's been a little bit of conversation about that. I'm not sure if you want to kick things off and sort of go over the nuts and bolts of what you proposed.
Sure. So there has been quite a bit of conversation, and I think it's come to a really good place. We've been exploring a lot of the subtler edge cases and making sure that we can hit most of the use cases that we care the most about. The big kind of thing that's changing is the statement in the two big things in the RFC as it currently stands. I just pushed just a work in progress commit. I haven't finished up all the implementation updates to it, but essentially we had previously in our initial discussion of this had talked about having overrides effectively be a one and done kind of thing. So once there's a match on a given package, we will not apply any other overrides, whether they're objects or string values. That doesn't quite work. The other thing is the way the sort of specific mechanics of how we merge together and deduplicate packages based on the nested override rules needed a little bit more subtlety to it as well. We identified a handful of cases that would be sort of reasonably deduplicatable, but were not going to be deduplicated in the proposal as it initially stood. So on the one and done issue, there is a case where you have, let's say, I want to set all versions of React to 16, and also I want to override one of the dependencies of React 16. So in order for that to work, you have to be able to apply both a string override to say version 16, React should be this version, and also an object override that says React at 16 should have these updates to its dependencies. It's a little bit kludgy, but what we don't need to do, and what I pushed back on, was having some way of having a value in the overrides object, which is both, which is like an array of like a string and an object to do like nested as well as a direct override. I think the Semver is flexible enough. You can do 16.x, caret 16. Like there's a lot of ways to kind of express the same thing. So that's not such a big deal. But what that meant was we sort of have to treat string value overrides and object value overrides separately so that we can build up this rule set and have it apply down throughout the tree. And then also only deduplicate things if they were subject to the same override rules, or if those override rules were not relevant within that branch of the dependency graph. Obviously, if I have a package with a dependency that got overridden, and another version of the same package, but its dependency didn't get overridden, well, those two things can't be deduplicated because they're not going to have the same dependency override in place. I'm just kind of pulling up the
latest and greatest. So anybody else wants to jump in? The use case where you have a string and an object, I don't actually see that. I think I'm looking at the right one, which is the new RFC, right?
Yeah, so it's pull request 129 and the npm RFC's repo.
But I don't see a example in here of a string and object override like you were just talking about. Do we have one we can center this conversation around?
Reload the page and you will see a work in progress do not merge commit.
Okay, I'll go look at that commit specifically. Okay, so like this React 15 and then React at 15 with loose NVFI inside, right? That's what we're
right. Okay. There's an example there. The heading is combining string value overrides with object value overrides.
Okay, yes.
Just copy and pasted the reference to that section for object overrides, yeah.
So, I mean, obviously, as you can probably guess by the commit message on this, I expect that this commit will get amended out or rebased out once we come to some more resolution on this, but it's something we can at least point to in this conversation.
John's just noting if somebody's got a beeping in the background.
That would be me because there's a UPS. I'm sitting outside, sorry. If you couldn't tell by the waves and sunglasses.
UPS makes its way to Hawaii.
I apologize. So I was just going to say, though, I feel like, so this is probably, I would say, edge casey. So I think we can accept a little bit of less than optimal things in what we go with. That said, it looks really weird. Like as like a, if I was seeing this in something package JSON, I'd be like, what's going on here?
Sorry, what, Jordan, yeah, you want the link specifically there?
Thank you.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah, I mean, I think this, like, the expression there of having like y being overridden to 1, 2, 3, and then y at 1 has an object, which is, x at 1, 2, 3. That to me, I mean, it reads in a pretty straightforward way. I can see how it can get confusing, and certainly in some of these examples, I've intentionally gone, turn the dial all the way up on the like ludicrousness of what we show, just to kind of explore kind of the edges of this feature set.
Is there any concern about the duplication between specifying at star, at latest, or no at all? Like if I say React is 15, React at star is 14, and React at latest is 16 or something.
Yeah, like
right. So if you look at multiple string value overrides, there is kind of an example of that, not using star empty string and latest, which will all be, the same thing. But essentially the first string value that hits, it does not evaluate any more string overrides for that particular node.
So if I say react 15 and then react at 14, the second one has no effect because the first one has already claimed all the reacts.
So if you say react : 15, and then you say react at 14 : 16, yes, that second rule is irrelevant, right?
So if I flip the order of them, then all the 14s would become 16s, but then all of the reacts that
all of the other ones
by 14 would become 15.
That's correct.
Okay. Is it worth warning or erroring when there's irrelevant rules like that?
I don't know.
It's likely a bug, right?
Well, it might not be. Like in that case where I want to say all version 1s should become 3 and all version 2s should become 4. In that case, or all version 1s should become 3 and everything else should become 4. Like having that kind of catch-all rule might be totally reasonable.
Right. I guess I'm not asking like in the case where in my specific momentary dependency graph, it's irrelevant, because you're right. Like that catch-all rule might be reasonable, and maybe tomorrow a new version gets published that invokes it. What I'm saying is in the case where I've first specified at star or no version at all, that means that for, let's say, React, that means that any further mention of React as a string form can't do anything no matter what. And that seems like an error condition to me. Like no one would ever be doing that on purpose.
Doesn't that get into the realm of like checking for any overlap, right? Because like you're saying latest and star, that's perfectly, viable.
Well, latest is maybe a special case because that's a dist tag that can change.
Okay,
and like,
but even star and unqualified is the same
Yes.
as saying React between 1 and 2, and then following it with React greater than 1.1 and 2. It's like, well, yeah, we have overlap, but like, I mean, there's tons of cases where we'll end up having that as a possibility. Do we need to then go and check all of them? Because that sort of blows the scope out.
I mean,
or even like 1.2 and then another rule for 1.2.x, right? Like those are the same semper range. So
right.
And if we were to try to like deduplicate it based on whether the set of comparators that each semper range resolves to are effectively equivalent, boy, that's adding a lot of work.
Okay. Yeah, I guess I was more thinking of like the common case, which is that like that somebody may not realize exactly how these things are working. And like what you're describing, Isaac, is the sort of, and what Wes is describing is sort of the more exhaustive checking, which is like normalize everything to comparators. And then if there's any comparators that are no ops or something like that, like, or anything where all the comparators for it are no ops, then warn or error. Like that's
it's really like is the comparator fully contained within a previous comparator, right? It's not even like overlap or it's
and so well I'm not pushing for that, although that sounds nice because I understand that might be difficult. I'm more saying like, is there a simpler like subset of those error cases that could be addressed, like to handle those very basic ordering issues, or is that worth it? Like
a simple compare.
I think I lean towards it not being worth it. And as much as I love sort of being able to identify issues and deterministically, say this is probably a problem and provide some kind of warning or something. One thing to consider with this feature is it's only in the root package.json that it matters. And so if you're adding it, like you're adding an override right there, probably because you want something to resolve a particular way. And you're probably going to look at what gets resolved as you're adding the override, right? Like you're doing it because, oh, why am I getting React 15 here? Oh, I see. Let me add an override to solve that problem. I'm not just going to like add the override and leave. And
I am not so sure that in large teams I would have that confidence. In an app where 1 or 2 people is only ever touching package.json, I think you're correct that it's reasonable to expect that those people know what they're doing. But at the various companies I've worked for, people change things they don't understand all the time. And if the tooling doesn't already have a check that will fail CI when it's incorrect, then infra teams have to build one.
I mean, I hear you, but you know, this is also like, again, even if you're kind of like in a very you know, brute force and somewhat clumsy way, you're saying we have hereby declared that there shall be no React 15 at this company, and everything gets an override added to package.json that explicitly sets React to version 16 everywhere. Well, that's either gonna break stuff or it's not. I don't know. And I mean, the hazard of there being an override rule which doesn't get hit is just it doesn't get hit. And like, if that's a problem, you go and look at it, and I don't feel like it's that hard to unpack, right? Like,
I mean, yeah, I think it's a defensible position to say that, like, if they're not aware that there is a problem, then it's probably fine. But yeah, my sensibilities tell me that people often have problems they're unaware of, and that when tooling can surface that in very loud, faily ways, it's helpful. That doesn't mean we have to add this feature here. I'm just kind of talking about it out loud.
Sure. Yeah, I think the other hazard is that there may be, because it's kind of such a new, or the other thing that's leaning me more towards the don't worry about it side, is that it is a relatively new feature. And it's one with a lot of interesting and subtle use cases, right? As we found in the previous discussion where we went through some of these things. And so I'm not so sure that there isn't a reason to do that, right? So you might, I can't imagine one right now, but to really sit down and say, if there is, you know, a Semver range, which is a subset of some other Semver range and comes after it, like, unless I can actually prove that rule will never be hit, which I could by analyzing the subsets of each Semver range. But
could I use this for comments? React : something, React : this is why we overrided React.
You can put a / member in your package JSON in any object, and we have committed to never using the / field for any purpose. So
I mean, I appreciate your caution for unknown use cases. And that's probably sufficient to say, let's not do anything about it right now. But I also can't even conceive of how that would be useful if it can never have an effect.
So the other thing that is kind of weird or interesting is that the piece on the left side is not necessarily a name at Semver range. It's a named package specifier. So that could actually be you know, a get repo link or even a get repo link with a particular commit or a particular branch name. So establishing that one thing is always going to be overridden by another, it becomes even more sort of complicated. And I know that, yeah, we could say, okay, there's a special case for star and an empty string, because those are literally identical. But then we also have to have, like, you know, star, empty string, and greater than equal to 0, 0, 0. And then, you know, it just becomes kind of a ballooning set of special cases. If it was straightforward, and I think it is somewhat straightforward to say, you know, if they are both Semver ranges, and one is entirely a subset of the other, and it comes after the other one, we could do that. We're getting into like n cubed territory on, albeit for a relatively small n, right? You're unlikely to have hundreds of overrides in a package
Right.
JSON. Haha, I'm sure that'll never happen.
I mean, if you
But,
think that that's functionality that you could build, it just wouldn't be like performant, and you wouldn't want it to be in the first version. Is that the sort of thing that could maybe be added to npm as like a separate command or flag later?
yeah, or even like a userland tool to do it. We have semver.subset now in the latest version of node semver. So it wouldn't be impossible to just build sort of a standalone thing that would analyze your overrides and see if there are subsetted semvers that come after in the object. It's more that like doing it as a special case is inelegant, and doing it elegantly, I worry about the performance, and so kind of says to me, let's punt it for now. So we can move on past that.
And then the other thing I wanted to talk about today, which tell me if you want to punt it to later in the meeting, was the thing I talked to you about in Slack, like match keeping the versions the same.
Right. So that was an interesting idea. We touched on it briefly, I think, in another Slack conversation, and just didn't end up pursuing it. But the idea there for posterity is, I want to say, all versions of foo at 1.x should map to my fork of foo, npm : my fork / foo at the same version number, right? So maybe
it's
there's
even
like
broader than that. It's saying for all versions of foo, I'm maintaining an internal company fork of foo, and I have republished every version matching the same as the external one. And so I want all foos at whatever specific version to be at me / foo at that exact same version.
Right.
Like, and is there some way? And yeah.
So one way that we could tackle that is to when we sort of resolve what the right hand side of those string override expressions would be, we can have some string interpolation or capturing that goes on. So if you do like $ curly brace version close curly brace, then that will be like whatever version number was matched. I see Wes kind of like grimacing at this subject.
Well, this is the concern I brought up earlier, which is like in the initial conversation. If we start going down this route, we're going to end up with something just so complicated that most users are going to not get it, and they're going to have a lot of problems getting it wrong, and we ended up having a lot of support burden and stuff where we is maybe unnecessary. I hadn't heard this conversation in the Slack, so I do actually think it's a very interesting one, because I think we have this at Netflix.
Mm-hmm.
What if it was just, if there's no version, it uses the version from the left hand of the expression?
Well, so that doesn't work, right? Because the thing that we're replacing it with is not a version number. The thing that, remember, so the left-hand side is a named package specifier. The right-hand side is an unnamed package specifier, which has to use the same name, right? Because it's replacing in the same spot. So if you want to change the package name, you have to use the alias specifier, npm : package name at version.
But that's what I'm saying. What if the other side was npm package name, no version, instead of some sort of interpolation logic, right?
So you're sort of suggesting that if we have, if the right-hand side is an alias specifier, and it doesn't have a version, then we tack a version number onto it. The challenge there is it makes it so that you can't just override to the latest and greatest version of my thing, right? So I might want to say, like, let's say I'm not publishing all versions. Let's say I'm just, I keep up to date with the one that we should be using. So I want to say all Lodashes go to at my company / Lodash. And we keep that at latest, and latest is always the one that we should be using everywhere.
Right, but then can't we just say you have to specify version, and that version is latest, right? So it'd be, my fork at latest. Otherwise, use the version that was matched on the left-hand side of the expression.
I mean, honestly, for V1, I'd like to do neither.
Totally on board with that. I am like, that is what I was trying to say is let's like reduce the complexity as much as possible.
But yeah, and I can certainly appreciate like the user facing complexity of having like capture groups or, you know, special like environment variables that get pasted in there or whatever. I mean, we got requests for putting environment variables in npm RC, and I think that's really useful in a lot of CI scenarios where people do like, you know, token equals $ npm token. But yeah, it also leads to some really kind of confusing cases when users do try to push it. So it would not be like every npm config that we just sort of slap in there. We would just define like, look, you can use these 3 strings, like version or resolved or, you know, whatever, like that's all you're going to get.
Just so I want to make sure that I'm following along here. That was the idea here, Jordan, with that use case or example, is to have some sort of wildcard for updating.
Yeah, it's saying that I want to, that I am maintaining an alternative to an existing package that might be used in various versions throughout my dep graph. And I want to transparently swap out any instance of that package with my better replacement at the same version.
Okay.
So you could like the contrived example I came up with to talk about in Slack with Isaac was a dependency has raw source and also it transpiles to CJS, and I want to ship native ESM.
So you truly do need that as a variable. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So I mean, I could obviously I could enumerate all existing versions and just have a massive overrides thing, but that's the workaround. But that would be really annoying.
I was thinking of something more trivial, just like star, like a wildcard star as the left-hand assignment, and then the just latest, like if we were to support.
Yeah, if something like that would work. The problem is that star and latest kind of have this expectation that they resolve to the actual latest version.
So the wildcard is actually like the name, like the package name. Like, so like it would be all like that's how I'm looking at that, as like a wildcard star for all packages, and then the right hand assignment is the semver. So it could be like, I don't know.
And actually, I'm wondering, yeah, I mean, so dropping the version is also that was talked about in chat, but I'm also wondering, now that I'm talking about it, the alias field or like the alias option, but I'm not sure that applies to the whole graph or not. But yeah, I mean, so oh, I see. Like, so Darcy, you're suggesting that is the object option. So I would say like foo : and then say star maps to this other version. But the but in that case, you said like is latest the other package name?
No, that'd be the, I guess it.
I'm talking about
latest.
I don't maintain foo.
Star.
Star.
One match all the packages, right?
Yeah, 1 second.
Okay, yeah. Anyway, this may or may not be, because of the workaround, even though it's a super painful one, it may not be critical to address. It just popped into my head. I see.
Yeah, so that would break the model of having nested overrides as objects, though, right? Because you're saying foo at star. You're not saying all dependencies of foo.
So in the, sorry, I guess I was going off of the object overrides example, or sort of like carrying on that work in progress that you shared, Isaac, and then the sort of nested object version. Then I was saying like essentially then all depths. That's why I'm trying to utilize the left hand like wildcard for is
right. Yeah.
So on the left hand again, we're utilizing the star as like special wildcard for the package names, like all depths, and then the right hand assignment is the semver. So,
oof, I have big feels about mixing globs and semver stars
Sure.
here.
Yeah, sure. For sure. Like it looks confusing. So star colon star like looks confusing, but like I think yeah, I don't know.
Well, I wonder if it could also be done with
If we're trying
like, you
to
know how
like,
with
we're not
the
going all the way, like that doesn't solve for
yeah.
the use case that Jordan brought up specifically, but it does. I don't know. That would be an interesting solve.
So the other thing I mentioned in Slack was in the same way you can do like git colon slash slash or SSH colon slash slash or git plus SSH colon slash slash. There's the npm colon thing. I wonder if we could do something like alias plus npm colon and a package name. And then I'm saying all foos become mapped to this alias plus whatever it is, and which I can specify a version, but if I don't specify one, it just inherits the version across. I don't know. Just throwing that out. Because they're already basically protocols, and that's like the mechanism for modifying protocols. You know? Yeah. It's definitely not something that has to be in the V1 as long as the V1 doesn't preclude a solution to it. And you know, maybe even if it does, we just have to decide that.
So I mean, I feel like as much as it is sort of inventing a new programming language, just having a string capture on certain fields from the left-hand side or from the node being overridden, from an implementation side is much simpler, right? It's just like, let's just replace this particular string with this other string. What that allows us to do is kind of maintain the elegance of saying the left-hand side is a named package specifier, the right-hand side is an unnamed package specifier. If you match the left, then you get overridden to the right, and then we're done. If we start adding other kinds of syntax to either one of those, like adding new dependency specifier types, right? Like somebody's going to want to be able to do npm install x at alias plus npm colon, or like put that in their dependencies list or whatever. So this way we can say everything that's, the right-hand side is always something that can kind of be like a key in, or a value in your dependencies list. Yeah, we're bike shedding a little bit.
Yeah. Totally, like beyond a little bit. Okay. In terms of moving forward with this, though, so you've just updated this RFC, Isaac. Like,
yeah. So everything down. I've got basically everything down to the implementation section should be up to date. The implementation section is not just wrong, but actively misleading. Don't look at it.
in terms of keys or config, etc.
Yeah. Well, just in terms of like the algorithm that I had imagined originally for doing this is not actually going to work. It's a little too naive, because what it doesn't allow you to do is sort of inherit overrides from a parent object. Once you go onto a new object override, it like forgot about all of its parent rules. So you couldn't have something like X is like all versions of X are 1.2.3, but underneath Y, all versions of Z are 1.2.3. And if Y also depends on X, then it should also get that same override applied from the parent rule set.
Why does this feel like CSS?
Because it's a declarative matching.
Skating. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's actually kind of similar in some ways. It's order dependent, etc. But where I think we landed was, and what's described in the text, but not in the implementation section, is that rule sets are inherited effectively and only overridden by the child rule set. So if you have that scenario, then Y would get 1, 2, 3 versions of both X and Z in its dependency graph. The implication there is that the deduping logic has to be a little bit more involved, because if I can end up in a case in the dependency graph where I have two different modules that were both sort of subject to a combination of inherited rule sets and end up with the same effective rule set of overrides. And in that case, all of their dependencies should be able to be deduplicated, because they were kind of subject to the same rules. And then after we build out the tree, we can find all the nodes whose overrides were not relevant at all and say, look, none of this thing's dependencies actually hit a string value override. So we can sort of deduplicate those up to the top level as well, or to the highest level that they could normally go if there were no overrides. And so just tracking like which override rules were relevant in which portion of the graph kind of becomes an interesting little crossword puzzle, interesting little Sudoku to do, which is arborist's reason for existence. So that's sort of the natural place to stick a bunch of this logic there in that build ideal tree step.
Cool. Is there any, like, so in terms of like feedback that you're looking for, especially I know there's a couple, Wes even brought up a comment that he wanted to add in terms of, how folks might want to be using overrides or sharing overrides. Is there any specific feedback you're looking for right now in terms of this this implementation?
So I think, I think we have pretty good alignment on like what's going to be in V1, and in these conversations where we've been getting to, I feel like we're not really, we're getting to the point of either proposing whole new stuff, which would be cool and great, but really kind of needs its own RFC and its own examination, and is not precluded by anything that's in this, or we're and so what might be good is to say, here's a set of things, here's a bunch of use cases that this does not cover. We're not going to give you the capture groups for the version or the resolve values. There's no way to share config. It's just you have to put it in your package JSON yourself. There's no analysis of like potentially useless rules that we could determine statically. But these are all kind of like sort of identify those use cases as won't fix for now, but could have a future RFC. And so that probably belongs in this RFC document, at least as a kind of honorable mention.
So are we sure that the RFC doesn't preclude any of these ideas? So if we were to go not with the capture group, but with the just pull the version over, that would be a breaking change, right? So that would be, because there today would be the possibility of aliasing without a version, which would be like latest.
Yeah,
right?
It does. That
Whereas
would be.
If we did the version copied over, that's breaking. And I think there's some other things that might be a conflict if we had some sort of shared implementation as well, like I brought up in the issue with the distributing overrides across a company. I think because the way that we're talking about, it's all in one package JSON, so you have control. So if there's conflicts or anything, we don't really need to worry about them now. Whereas if we did want to support shared rule sets in the future, I think we'd probably have to think a little bit more deeply about the merging options that we've sort of said are not part of it today, right?
Well, let's dig into the shared config idea. You brought this up briefly.
Yeah.
Do you want me to just
config on install?
Yeah, pitch it a little bit.
Yeah, so here's so we have this at Netflix in our Java ecosystem. So this is why I'm bringing this up. So obviously there are solutions which do work for this in other ecosystems. So generally the idea is a central team manages a product. that product may be used in, you know, a bunch of different use cases, but when they look at the dependency graph, they want to apply some restrictions across the entire company. So this may mean that like there's overlap in the trees between the centrally managed product and some specific implementation that pulls in other dependencies, right? But the central team needs to say, no. Even if you're getting that, if you cannot dedupe down to my supported set of transitives, we need, that's a problem, right? So we use this to say, give like strong recommendations across the entire organization on what versions of specific transitive dependencies we want them to use, right? We do this via this thing in our Nebula. This is on the Java side. They have a wrapper around Gradle, which tells Gradle, hey, here's some constraints that we want you to resolve for. In the JavaScript ecosystem, we definitely don't have anything like this. We're discussing a few different options with something like a shared dependency that everybody installs, which uses peer dependencies as sort of a hack, right? So you would install, you know, Netflix recommended, you know, peer deps, and then it would have some strong constraints on, we say we only want React above, you know, 14 or something, right? And then anybody who had that their install would say, oh, you're not meeting the peer dependency of React greater than 14. You've got React 12. And that's a warning, not an override, right? So the idea here would be we'd be able to provide a similar functionality where the override would actually then apply on top of their tree.
So that is really interesting. In NPM 7, as it currently stands, that will not be a warning. That would be your install fails.
Yeah, totally. And that's why I'm thinking that will work for when NPM 7 lands as a workaround, but it feels very hacky, right? Like,
right.
Also, you're going to have peer dependencies that fail your build, like, seems really weird.
Also, it'll actually add all of those peer deps, rather than, and you might not even need any version of a lot of them.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, exactly. The idea is it's better as an override than this sort of hacky method.
Right. Because then it'll only hit those things. So, yeah. So my thinking on this, there's a couple of ways we could go. One way is, you know, kind of the simplest, and just say, like, I'm not going to solve this problem. It's your problem. You have some kind of linter or post commit hook that verifies that you have the sort of standard approved company-wide overrides in each package JSON in each repo, and you just have process to flag those when they're not set properly.
Which is, for what it's worth, exactly what we did with Gradle before they went and implemented some of these features internally. So right. I'm happy with that if that is the decision. But if we could get it, I think it would be pretty high value to orgs like mine.
Right. So another possibility that comes to mind is we have some way to set overrides in a npm RC file or somewhere else in the config.
Would this be similar? I noticed, like, the only other example I can see is like node.dir as a flag for referencing, let's say, like a file. We would have something like override path.
Override file, yeah.
Override file, override paths. So then you could be distributing like a specific overrides JSON file to your team.
Yeah, it would be really nice if it could be remote, but I understand why that adds a whole ton of other complexity. So yeah, if we just had one file. At that point, though, it still seems like publishing a package that contains overrides and letting a user configure their project to say, my override should come from this package, would be a better way than just having it be some arbitrary file in the file system, right? Because it might be different package ecosystems have different bundles of overrides they want to adopt, right? Like, I think about this kind of like an ESLint config kind of thing, right? Which is like, I'm going to use the gRPC thing provided by the Netflix core gRPC team, right? And that team publishes a set of opinions on what transitives they want to work with, right? Mm-hmm. So it seems to me like using another npm package is actually the you get a lot of benefits out of that, right? You can version the overrides, you can do all sorts of other things that are nice to haves, where our npm RC file path doesn't really solve some of those problems, right?
Yeah, and the other downside that I was going to say, like, so we can put objects and multiple string keys and everything else in the ini file format. It's a little janky and less humane for expressing objects than JSON is, obviously, but like can be done. The bigger downside there, whether we use npm-rc as it currently is, or we define some other like JSON file that defines these objects, the bigger downside for me is now you're taking the config away from the thing that it's configuring, and we get into kind of spooky action at a distance, where it's like it's not clear why I'm getting, like, why am I not getting the latest version of React? I keep doing npm install React at latest and getting version 14. What the hell? Like, that's going to be really much more confusing, I think.
So the Java ecosystem has this problem, and the way that they solve it is by having basically an explain that tells the user what things are being applied when they're installing. So if they have an override, it'll say like, hey, we're applying this override. That's why this package is not getting exactly what you're asking for. Yeah.
I'm my experience is that people tend to not read those things.
Totally, very much. There's a blindness, and we've seen this blindness happen. That said, it's a lot easier to say, hey, just read the logs, it's right there, than it is to try to submit a PR to every single repo in an entire ecosystem, right? To override like that.
So the other thing is, we don't currently have any kind of concept of team level configs. And so that's kind of that is in and of itself an interesting avenue. Defining it based on a package seems interesting, right? We could kind of get most of the way there in userland with a like post install script or something like that, which just says, okay, let me look at, walk up the tree, find the package JSON, and just go ahead and mutate it. Kind of verges into the territory of bad behavior for a dependency to do that, but
I mean, you could do it at the top level with a pre-install script that modifies its own package JSON.
Well, I'm saying, like, I want to do npm install Netflix company overrides for React, and have that change just by doing that npm install, now I get those overrides. Right. That would have to be a post install script on that particular dep.
Yeah.
But I think to Jordan's point, we could also have that install package, instead of actually applying the override, say on pre-install. So like the installation doesn't do the change. It says, if you want to have this run regularly, add this pre-install script. And then the user's opted into a, more, and then pre-install would just be like npx, apply overrides or whatever, right?
Would that ever, we're getting into like implementation details of userland stuff, so probably the right answer is let's try it all. But some things to consider there is, if it's a pre-install, just a message that exits with status code 0, that won't actually be shown, right? Because we're hiding those for all kinds of good reasons. If you want to beg for money, you got to use npm fund and provide us the actual URL to go do it. And also then, optional deps that fail to build FS events because you're not on Darwin, like users don't get flooded with a ton of error looking output on Linux for installs that actually worked. So doing it as in that way, I think probably wouldn't work so great. But yeah, there's a number of opportunities there to be able to do it either as if you had a dependency that added or warned or, had some facility for setting overrides.
Yeah, so the really problem here is it's a chicken and egg, right? You need to have the overrides before you can apply them, and npm install is the thing that would get them if they were in a package. So if there wasn't some sort of top level consideration for like, do this thing, like pre-install timing, right? That can go and fetch the override.
Oh, I see what you mean. So I would like npm install Netflix overrides, and then I'd have to npm install again.
Right.
Yeah.
In order to apply them.
Mm-hmm.
But
that's kind of why I was thinking something where it was like if you had a configuration that said fetch this remote URL as your, and apply that override as if it was appended to the overrides list, right? That would be one way to solve the problem, but it would again require like an explicit feature in the CLI for this use case.
Right. This really feels like a V2, kind of add-on feature once we have all of the like implementation details of just what do we even do with overrides. Like, assume we get them from somewhere, now I have them, then what, right? Like there's plenty of territory there to still kind of iron out. Being able to fetch that data set from somewhere else shouldn't be terribly complicated, right? Like,
and especially if you put overrides fields in the pacument, like you could just get them as part of your initial npm install request.
Yeah,
like
that. I was thinking the exact same thing, but that gets into other territory as well. I know. Like,
I'm happy to also proof of concept some of this out, because I mean that's effectively what we did in our Java ecosystem is we built some stuff, then discussed with the Gradle folks how that could look, supported by the tooling directly. And I'd be happy to just repeat that sort of process.
Yeah, what I wouldn't want to do is have somebody install something that like depends on something that tries to hack with overrides, and now their whole tree gets mucked up because they installed the dep. Like the spooky action at a distance is just, we have that so consistently with almost everything that we do with configs that let you change stuff, right? There's I'm sure you've all seen on npm issues where like config flags, like what's one, engine strict is a big one that like breaks people, and then they kind of don't know why. They're like, how come it works in this project and not that one?
So just quickly, time check. We got about 4 minutes left before the hour. I want to see if there was, follow-ups here that we are going to have, or if we can pare this down and then punt some or add, as you said, Isaac, these other use cases, these other like user land features that like potentially we can discover in tooling beyond just like what we're planning on offering with this first like phase of overrides. Is there like tangible, is this just like we need to clean up the RFC and then accept it?
Yeah, so I think I'm going to add these ideas of either like version defaults for aliases, which has some interesting complexity. I'm realizing now if you actually had X that resolved to a Git dependency, and then I want to override it with npm add fancy X, I can't just copy the same version or the same resolved field because it's going to be different. But yeah, capture groups kind of feels maybe easier. I'm sort of just thinking about implementation here. The other stuff around like sharing configs, also I'll mention some of the topics that we touched on here, and just kind of as an area for further exploration.
Cool. Does anybody have anything else they want to add before we hit time? If not, I'll give folks 2 minutes back, and appreciate everybody jumping on for the call. As usual, we have our Open RFC, general Open RFC calls next week. So those are bi-weekly, alternating with these deep dives. So we can queue up another topic for the next bi-weekly deep dive in that call. And also, hopefully, let's bring up any topics or any discussion about this specific RFC in the PR itself if we missed anything. But yeah, appreciate everybody jumping on. Hopefully everybody is staying happy, healthy, safe right now. I know it's tough, but I'm seeing some smiley faces, so that's a good sign. Yeah, with that, I will end the stream and hopefully see you folks next week.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks,
Thanks.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.